start, we have really brilliantly, we have Mark Howland, gives a wave, Mark.
Hello.
Who's over in near Malden. What's the, I can't remember, what's the name of the place?
Holsbury.
Holsbury. Near Malden, and you used to live in Billericay, and we worked together twice, didn't we? We worked on, first on daunted, which was my first opera.
Yeah.
And that was for English touring opera, which opened at Hackney Empire, which is really brilliant because I live next door to Hackney Empire, so that was really easy for me. And then went on tour, and then we worked together on The Mammoth Beast, which was our version of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which is the most successful show in the history of the theatre.
Fantastic. You couldn't get two more contrasting productions.
You couldn't, no. No, but that's interesting actually, because the language is still quite similar, isn't it? I suppose in lots of it, creating worlds and environments, and both, because they're both gone extraordinary journeys. Both are epic journeys within them. Obviously, one is a bit more literal than the other one. And you've been a lighting designer for how long?
I have been a lighting designer for getting on now for 20 years, really, from the very first sort of amateur productions that I started on, and then the student drama that really kicked me on to realising that it was a career choice, really, through everything from opera, as we talked about, to a few site-specific projects and an awful lot of theatre in between, really.
And we've got David Shearing here as well. If you give us a wave. And some of you may know David, because David has been attending the Outer Limits sessions. David's also a board member of the Queen's Theatre, Hornchurch. And we might, maybe later on actually, it might be worth just talking about what it is, because it's always a bit strange. We talk about board members, we don't really know. Often, I think lots of people don't know what they do. And it's very significant to have an artist on a board, because quite often I think that doesn't happen, and which is strange, because the making of the work is the is the central thing that we will do, and then we don't have anyone on the board that reflects the making of the work, which is so it's really brilliant to have David on. And David, you're from a Hornchurch, aren't you?
Yeah, I was brought up in Romford, and then my parents sort of slowly moved out a little bit to sort of Hornchurch, Upminster, but my relationship with the Queen started from a very young age, actually, from going to see the pantos, then joining the youth programs in the late 90s. And so I've always had a sort of connection to the area and the theatre, but for the last 15 years or so, I've been living elsewhere in the country and working elsewhere.
And moved back recently?
Yeah, in the last 2 years. It took a bit of a change to get settled a bit, but yes, I'm back now in the East.
So it was really, I really wanted to have designers come in, because often we haven't had any designers in these sessions, really, and just to talk about that language that would be really great for us all to be thinking about, and how we use it within our work. Certainly for me, when I started out directing, I think I lit and did the sound for everything on the Fringe to begin with. And then I remember getting onto the Regional Theatre Young Director Scheme, which is a trainee scheme for directors. And you get placed with a theatre. And I was saying to Mark and David earlier on that when I went to Salisbury Playhouse, I was directing quite quickly. I was really terrified of working with a lighting designer or a sound designer. But actually, sound didn't really exist so much then. That's very new, actually, relatively new. But certainly with a lighting design, because I was just frightened that of looking really stupid, because I didn't know what a name of what a cantata was, or a profile, of which obviously that's all. Oh, here's Ollie actually. So I just wanted to. Hold on. Do you want? I've nearly removed Oliver Yellop. Once removed, Oliver will not be able to be. No, cancel. I'm trying to let him in. So I just wanted to really talk about that, because I love, one of the most exciting things about my job is the collaboration with the design team. It's absolutely thrilling, and it pushes you, and pushes you further and further. Sorry, Ollie is trying to join. He's trying to join 4 times. So I'm not sure what's going on there. So, Mark, how did you get into be a lighting designer? And how did you know that was something that you could do?
Well, when I started doing the amateur theatre, I didn't really know that was a specific job title, really. I went off to university to study a degree, expecting to keep theatre as a bit of a hobby. Soon got sucked into the huge amount of student drama that was available, and ended up working as a casual at the local theatre, alongside trying to do my degree, not very successfully. Working on a lot of the touring productions as a freelance member of staff, as a stage manager, set hand, flyman, all the rest of it, and including as a electrician. And certainly as I got more involved in the student drama, one started to see that there was this person that was taking over responsibility for the lighting and having discussions with the director and putting that element of the show together. And it was fascinating for me to see that. And as my degree started to tail off and I realized I wasn't really going to see that through, and I realized that actually the theatre industry was somewhere that one could look for a career option, I started to do a little bit of research into it by talking to the local staff, and looked to that as a possible career choice. And what fascinates me about lighting specifically in the theatre is, of the disciplines, it seems to be the best combination of the art and the technical. You have to have a bit of technical knowledge to know what equipment you're using and where you're putting it and how to use it together. But it's also obviously extremely artistic. You're having those artistic collaborations and discussions with the director and the set designer. And it really seems to be the best marriage of the two worlds. And that was absolutely fascinating to see that come together. And as someone who enjoyed both the technical elements and growing the show, I thought that was definitely the way to go. Ended up going off to drama school, quit my degree, managed to get onto a lighting specific course, which was very short and very practical, working with other designers, and got straight on really going and relighting and assisting other lighting designers to see how they would work and to get some sort of experience as to how they were involved in the profession. And then going on and lighting my own pieces from small little fringe shows and little bits for small companies, and then working on bigger and bigger productions, which has been fantastic. And it's been amazing to see the art grow to a certain extent, because as Doug mentioned, sound design is a relatively new thing. Lighting design was only a little bit before then. It's not long ago that most shows were lit by the chief electrician of the venue in collaboration with the director. And lighting design has grown from that in the same way that sound design is growing now. That it used to just be the chief sound engineer who would put together some sound effects for a show, and now the sound designer is a specific role, and that happened to lighting not all that much longer ago. And so it's nice to be part of that still growing industry to a certain extent.
And just tell me about how do you make a design? You know, what is the process of making a design and that collaboration?
It's very different for everybody, has a different process, and it can be different depending on the specific production. It generally always begins with reading the script and discussions with the director and set designer about their image of the show. I always try and go through the script several times, once to read it to make sure I understand the piece, and then with a view to annotating it with anything that might reference something that could be interpreted as a lighting thought, whether it's time of day, whether it's location, whether it's atmosphere or mood, or a character's thoughts and feelings. And that begins to put into my mind a picture potentially of how the feel of the show could be affected by the way it's lit and looks. You then take those thoughts into a discussion with the director and the set designer, again looking both artistically and practically. You have a discussion about elements of the visual aesthetic of the show, whether we're thinking of something that should be naturalistic or particularly stylized, monotone, very chromatic, and also technical and practical points. Lighting design has to work very closely with set design. There are physical limitations with how you can light certain pieces, and that has to be considered with the set. There are plenty of examples of design, directors or designers having specific suggestions for how a scene should look, only to put a big piece of scenery in the way of the light that would give that effect. And so there is always a technical discussion to be had there as well. And then once you've got in your mind a picture of what you want the show to look like, it's then literally back to the drawing board and the computer now, and trying to relate those pictures in your mind to the technical equipment and the shape of the space, the venue and the set. And that can be a very long process. And often it's design and redesign. You think in your head of a few things that might work, and think of different options of achieving it. And we're greatly helped now by various visualization packages. So if one has the set design available in 3D, one can actually model it up on your computer and literally try specific lighting angles and shades of light on particular elements of the set. And that process goes on through the rehearsals, trying to get into rehearsals and getting a sense for the way the show's developing, because the show often evolves throughout the rehearsal process, and that can have quite a big impact on the way it looks or the way it's lit. And so one has to have an element of that design changing through the rehearsal process just to allow things to come together. And then the purely technical element of it, you have the plan with the list of equipment that goes off to the venue, and you hope that's all available and all goes up in the right place. And then the technical rehearsal process as you're putting the show together, which is my most exciting part of the process really, and the most nerve-wracking, finally getting to try those elements out with everybody else in the space and on the stage, which often requires a lot of rethinking on the hoof as you're going along. If you're very lucky, it all looks great first time. There's usually a bit of rethinking and a bit of rejiggling, and sometimes you can make a discovery that completely turns the show on its head, whether that's by the way something is lit or by the way somebody else, whether it's a performer or whether it's one of the other creatives, discovers something in the space that can make you go back and completely rejig the way you imagined the show would work. And that can be a very exciting part of the process as well. When you midway through the technical process, you go, actually, we've made a discovery here. Let's try and filter that back into the rest of the show and see if that takes us in a more interesting direction.
And what would you say, just, predominantly what the role of LX within it? I mean, obviously, you talk about time there, which is, being able to be part of the rehearsal process, which is really hard as freelancers because you're juggling so many projects at the time. Yes. And as a lighting designer, it's really difficult to be, because obviously when you're in technical rehearsals, you're out for that whole week. Yeah. So if you're doing a technical rehearsal whilst I'm rehearsing and you're doing our show, I think the most successful relationships, those creative relationships between designer, lighting designer, they need to happen really early on.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, that's often missed in this country, unfortunately, that the lighting designer is brought on board with the process far too late in the day. The best discussions happen right at the very beginning, before any of the creatives have necessarily put pen to paper with any thoughts. And those discussions happen as you're germinating the idea, because we all have thoughts about the way the show can develop, and the earlier that thought goes in, the better, artistically and technically. As soon as you've got a show in mind, there are elements of that show that will point to specific effects or specific spacings or specific ideas. And a combination of set, lighting, sound, projection can all solve those in different ways. And the earlier you can start having those discussions, the more integrated those elements can be as you go down the road. And you can often tell when you watch a performance, those shows that have been designed by a creative team right at the beginning, where you can't necessarily tell whether what you're seeing is created by set, lighting, sound, or video, because all of those elements are so closely interwoven that they're all blending as one. Whereas a production where the designers have all come on board at different stages, you'll often see elements of them jar because they've not been melded together right at the very beginning. And that's true in terms of a technical element, such as a piece of set being put in a way that prevents a certain thing from happening, as well as a visual aesthetic where the two or three threads aren't running together.
And I think, that certainly as a director, often you end up working with the same people that you end up developing a relationship. It can be tricky, that the collaborative process, and there are lots of examples when that hasn't worked well. I really enjoy the collaborative process, so it's really important for me to have that they are collaboration is the values of the creative team. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is, because it can go really wrong, is that you end up having being safe and having the same creative team again and again and again, and it all gets locked in, and which is a shame, because you develop, obviously you share a vocabulary, like, and I'm sure, Mark, you know what my taste is for having worked on a couple of shows, and that, and I know, you know, and I know lots about about your taste as well. That it can can end up being close, and then you just do the same thing again and again. So within that collaboration, you have to kind of keep pushing as well, don't you?
It's one of the things I liked about my work at the Gate in Notting Hill. I must have done a dozen shows at the Gate, mostly with Chris Hayden, but also with Natalie Abrahami beforehand. And because of the way an element of their funding arrived, the set designers rotated for every show. So they had to get specific permission to use a set designer for more than one production, which wasn't true for lighting design. So I did a run of a dozen shows. Each of those shows, although it was with the same director, had a different set designer. So although I'd learnt a lot of the language with Chris and a lot of the way the space worked, we were always having a fresh pair of eyes, a fresh thought coming into that process. So although our collaboration had been relatively long term, there was always somebody new coming in that was making us think about the space or our ideas in a different way, which was really exciting.
Yeah, David just put something in the chat. Always have one new piece of jeopardy into the creative process, which I think is what Mark was saying there. And what? Just a couple of things. What does the actor need to be? Because I'm sure the actor doesn't feel that involved in the lighting process.
Possibly not early on, certainly not throughout rehearsals, because often they'll see someone strange come into the rehearsal room that they've barely known and wonder why they're sitting there with a script scribbling down all these notes. But again, it actually needs to be an element of collaboration. You need to work together. And I was lucky enough to work with Simon Callow on one of his one-man shows. And we had a fantastic discussion about it, mostly through the technical process, that he felt that my lighting work with him was his other performer. So he was acting to and with the lighting. So we were giving him something when there was nobody else on stage with him. He was having something else to interact with. We were representing some of the other characters or some of the other storytelling and the locations. And so that was really exciting for us to have that discussion as we were going through the tech. We would talk then together about how I and the way I lit the show could help him on stage feel more in tune with that particular scene, something that would work or wouldn't work. There might be things that jarred or just didn't feel right. And often the performer is the best person to judge whether it feels right. If they're stood on stage playing a scene together and suddenly they feel something is very wrong or unnatural, then it probably suggests that will read incorrectly to the audience out front. And you have to be prepared to open out those discussions. And that's not always easy in the way that some theatres are set up during those technical processes. You're often so busy sat at the production desk out front that you never make it backstage to the green room where you can have a chat over tea and coffee with the performers, and they might give you little bits of feedback and you can take those back with you. And I think that's often to be encouraged. But there's often such time pressure when you're sat out front, you don't get to have those discussions until it's a bit too late in the day.
And if you, because if you were a small company, or you're making a solo piece on your own in a small fringe theatre, what would your advice be in terms of thinking about LX, even if if you're doing your LX and you don't have a lighting designer?
Yeah, I think you really have to open your eyes to it. And some of the most beautiful things can be the simplest things. And it's amazing what you can do with one or two simple pieces of equipment. And whilst we are all in this time stuck in relatively small surroundings, often seeing the same space day after day after day, it's a very interesting time to take a bit of inspiration. You sit in the same room throughout the day, throughout the week, and especially at this time of year that's changing so much, and the room feels different constantly. And a lot of that is due to the quality of the light coming through the window, whether you've got the light on inside, whether you've got your computer screen on, and all the rest of it. And those simple things can be really, really effective. And that can be represented on stage really, really, really effectively. And that don't be afraid to ask for a little bit of assistance from the people at the venues, the technicians that might not necessarily be designers, but will have a sense technically of what might work and what doesn't work. It's amazing what you can do with a simple angle poise, different angles of the angle poise, simple little uplights from the table in front of you, using the space itself, the orientation of the space. It can all be an extremely effective way of changing how we feel within that room. And lighting, with the simple 1 or 2 pieces of equipment, can make a huge difference. And now is the time when you find yourself sat in the same room time after time after time after time, just to think about what actually makes us feel different. Simple changes of the shadows, the angle of the light, the orientation of the room, the light coming through the window, that is changed simply by a piece of paper in front of you. You put a different piece of paper on the table in front of you, the quality of reflected light onto your face changes every time, and that in itself can have an extremely strong emotive effect on the viewer.
Like Holly and Liz have got really good lighting effects at the moment, haven't they? Kind of visually. Go, David. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no, Mark. Well, I was wondering about how you get to play with light. You know, because it's quite, you know, when you use the systems, they can be quite constructed. And what you're talking about there is a really sort of organic thing, which is about understanding how it all works. So you're obviously using knowledge that you've already gained, and that's working through. But what points in the process allow you that ability to play, and how do you fit that in?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges, because schedules are always so tight, and there is always a real restriction on the amount of time you've got to experiment when you're actually in the theatre. Some companies that have their own little rehearsal rooms, you can relatively easily pick up, borrow from the local theatre a few units that you could put on a stand that you can have in the rehearsal room that you can move around. Take that a step further. When I, certainly early on in my career, when I was creating designs, I would always try and add into each design a couple of elements I wasn't certain about. I'd design the show with a few things that I thought would work, but then always add in 1 or 2 elements that I hadn't tried before, whether it was a colour I hadn't used before, whether it was an angle I didn't regularly use. And so during the tech process for that performance, that show, I could have a little bit of a try with some things that were slightly out of my usual palette or usual toolbox, and try them out for real. And sometimes they didn't work, sometimes they made it into the show. And certainly that's a very important way of opening up your eyes to a few additional ideas. I also have, you might not be able to see it behind me, I've got a couple of simple birdies in my office. So if I was trying to choose colours or look at the way different angles worked on a piece of scenery, model boxes are a great tool. With a simple maglite torch, just playing with the location, the way the maglite plays across the scenery from different positions within the model box, all scales up really, really well. And that opportunity to play is very, very valuable, and often one of the last things that's fitted into a schedule. Certainly finding a rehearsal room or a rehearsal space where you've got the opportunity with a simple stand and a Fresnel or a garden floodlight, where you can have a bit of a play around with angles, positions. It's a huge opportunity. And make sure again that you're seeing other people's work. If you're lucky enough to go and see something for more than once, then the second time you go and see it, try and have a look around and see how it's put together, and pick up a few tricks from other people. Don't be afraid to ask around and look at images and resources that are out there.
And I think it's probably something for us as well, you know, people who are using our rehearsal space. I think Lauren, I think we have had that anyway, having people asking for us for equipment to play with. But certainly if you've got rehearsal space, if you've got R&D, maybe negotiate that earlier on so that you've got some of those elements in a room to play with. David, I'm going to move over to you for a bit. Just will you tell me a little bit about your journey? Because, I mean, you talk about your work as being a kind of hybrid between fine art and performance art. How does somebody from Hornchurch end up, or how does anyone end up, you know, making up, you know, art, which is a hybrid of performance and
yeah, what being an artist means as well. There's
yeah, no, exactly. We talked about this the other day, didn't we? You know, that word artist is a tricky word, isn't it? I think I certainly do feel comfortable about calling myself an artist until probably, I don't know, 5 years ago.
My trick is I change it depending what application I've got in. So sometimes I'm a director, designer, or an artist.
Okay. That's a good tip. That's a really good tip.
The profile changes. And I think in our field, often we look for collaborators that we know what skills they've got. So we go to a lighting designer because we know they can do the light. And I often find myself as an artist in between things, so people don't know what they could get from me. which means I often produce my own work. But in terms of journey, I studied theatre studies and performance arts at college, and then eventually I went to Winchester to study performing arts at Winchester. It was devised contemporary performance practice. And the people we would look at were, Pina Bausch, Robert Lepage. And actually, we went to see Robert Lepage when I was in Haverly Sixth Form College. They got us down there to see that. And I think what I was mesmerized by was this idea that an artist is both the scenic designer and the director in some ways. And they've got a handle on the text, the design, and it's an auteur of the space. So they're totally integrated in a way that becomes really magical for me. And that's why it switches between sometimes designer and director, because actually you're directing you're producing space, you're producing spatial relations between the audience and the piece itself. So it comes from that perspective ultimately. After graduating from performance arts, I set up a theatre company. I did street theatre for a number of years, which is awful. It's just bad places to be working in. Punch, kicked, everything you can imagine being a street performer. And I started working for the South Bank Centre, just sort of day job really. And then we had these major exhibitions there, things like psycho buildings, and where they were really transforming space. And in the early 2000s, there was a lot of artists that are doing this immersive work. So Punch Drunk were coming about. And I was like, do you know what, why is it that audiences really want to go and experience this type of work? And I started to I went to study that further. So I did an MA in performance design. We used to be called MA scenography, and scenography is a term that we don't tend to use in the UK. So scenography is the designing of the scene, a drawing into space. So the writing, like photography, writing of light, so drawing of the scene. And I started to make my own immersive participatory performances. That eventually fell into me doing a PhD into it, so audience immersion, so how to become immersed in performance and the experience of design. And so I did that at the University of Leeds, and that's where I was based for 10 years. And I was teaching design and studying it, so really asking audiences about their experience. So my work is a crossover really between sort of work that happens in theatre spaces, in studios, and work that happens outside. And I love working across those two mediums. One's hyper theatrical, and one's sort of it's like theatre with a job to do. It's socially engaged, and it's sort of, but both place the audience right at the heart of that experience. I could show you some examples. Do you want to see some?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I'd show you two examples. Let's see if I can. Post is disabled. You need to.
What's your screen share? I mean, what's your screen sharing? I think the interesting thing is that both Mark and David, you were exposed.
Are you able to enable my screen sharing, Doug?
Oh God. How do I do that? I can make you.
Host is disabled. Screen sharing.
I can make you a host, can't I? Would that mean you can do it? I'm going to make you a host. Make David change host. See if that allows you to do it.
It would be nice just to have this loaded up. So is that up?
Yeah.
I talk you through two kind of pieces just to give you a sense of the flavour. So this is the Weber machine. It was after the PhD, and I had to pitch to Sky to do a project. And I thought, what's the most sort of sellable idea? I was thinking about the weather. So essentially creating an experience where the audience goes inside a black box studio space. And I as an artist, I control everything in many ways. So I will start with a light rather than a text. So it will be the feel of the light, first of all, and then devising scenes out of what that light gives me. So the Weather Machine was essentially taking us through different experiences of the weather: wind, light, cloud, and rain. And I'm quite controlling in when I create a work. So I design all my own light, but I have never studied light. I had no idea what I was doing until I did my PhD with the light. Never touched one. And I love incorporating it. So this is a moment where it's about the sun and the heat, but actually it's in the story, it's about the feeling of that heat. And so you're feeling it and you're seeing it, and that combination, and the audience is right in the middle of these experiences, and there's no performers actually, so there's no physical actors. So the design is doing all the work. It's guiding us around the space. It's immersing us in these different worlds. I get guides. I do use performers. It is scripted, so I'll work with a writer who might kind of write the text, and we'll use voiceover artists to do the instructions. It's a bit like a sort of audio guide.
And what point does the script come?
Right from the very beginning. So the light, sound, objects, they're right from the beginning, and they're changing. So I'll say, I just feel like we need to do something about photosynthesis because that's about light. And then the writer will quickly write a scene about light. This is Kamal Khan wrote this one. And so it's really closely related. And so then he'll drop an image in the text, and then I'll put it back into the design. And so you're continuously writing text and space together and placing that audience in a relationship with it. This is the Jeopardy, so we made it rain in this one. And we use symbols and contact microphones to amplify it around the space. So really sort of to draw us into the depths of the sort of environment. So that's sort of using the weather, but then I also do a work, it's a kind of going to say what it is actually. So it's taking that into a more community-based focus as well. So making installations in public spaces so this is called the Weather Cafe, where I interviewed 100 people about their day-to-day lives, and I asked them how they felt, and I edited them into a sound score. So I'll do the editing, but I'll work with a composer to do that, or a digital engineer that will be involved. And we programmed it so the cafe was responding to the weather outside. So the design changes in relation to the weather. So you hear different voices when the mood changes. So you're kind of building dramaturgy and design, right? Dramaturgy being the sort of feed, the narrative, if you don't have a text, I guess, or even if you have text. But so you're building them in together. So you're really able to sort of control, but give the audience a really sort of personable, crafted experience where they're kind of in that process. I won't go into too many details, but there's a lot of community kind of involvement around recording all the voices. And that sense of magic as well, and that possibility to transform everyday life.
That's the thing about magic. I was just thinking about both of you talking. It's interesting that we're the experience and the nature of the majority of theatre, and obviously at this moment we're talking about moving everything outside. But we make audiences go into the dark, and we create some magic. We manipulate the dark, don't we? And then to create magic. I think the word that you say is the magic word is really important to how we use space and light and sound. But it's interesting that we take the audience in their journey into the darkness to illuminate.
Well, lighting is interesting actually, because you carve out darkness with light. So you start with nothing, and then you build up in that world. And well, even working outside is similar. So you have the same technique. So darkness, you're crafting it. It's turning things upside down, putting a boating lake on the roof, bringing the weather indoors. It's that type of twisting of our perspective on the world.
Such a strange thing, isn't it? It's sort of brilliant. It's a beautiful, obviously, and it's sort of about magic. You just said that about you had to pitch to Sky, and where they came up, because that's something we all experience, and that was a universal. Your other projects, obviously, because Mark, you were talking about, you go to start with the text, or you're responding to the design, or you'll play, or you look at photographs. I start with music quite often. I start with the text. I start with music quite often. So for your other projects, what's the beginning? What's the catalyst for? Not that's the creative spark, isn't it? So it can happen in lots of different ways. But
in terms of my work, sometimes it's a combination. So you're sitting there thinking, there's that image by Edward Hopper that I absolutely love, that person in the cafe. Then there's a piece of music, and I make playlists all the time. So big Spotify lists, they never make it into the show. And I'll work with a composer, and we'll come up with the themes around it. Or there's a particular issue. So the cafe in some ways was where in our lives do we get to stop and reflect without paying for the privilege? To take a moment out, to find out a story of someone else. So the idea of sitting and listening to someone else's story, and ultimately it's about building compassion. So I'll with the community-centered work, so how do we build a sense of compassion with each other without being literal? For me, it's hearing their stories. So it's still theatre to me, because it's about story right at the heart of it. But there will be a combination of things. So it'll be space, ability to sit down, ability to connect with someone else, understand yourself, an image, a picture, the idea that, yeah, it's controlled all by the weather, a sort of technical problem. And then you just like, how do I put it together? So it's often 3 or 4 starting points rather than one text. And
the same thing, it's like, how would you, I mean, how do you see work? How do you get exposed to, if there was something that you were interested in doing as a career, how do you go about starting that journey?
I think there are lots of schemes. You can tap into this work. What I liked about Leeds is there wasn't much of this there. So that was a really special thing to do, because you could travel around. In London, you'd have lots of it. And you can look at the London Lift Festival, Greenwich and Docklands Festival. So festivals are great places for this type of work to happen within. And so seeing those work, David Rosenberg with, he does piece, sound, Darkfield, Shunt. So there's a number of companies that are doing it. And often I have to produce my own work as well. So it's about fundraising. So I do all the applications and raise the money. And usually there's 3 or 4 funders that I'm partnering to make this happen. So a community partner, a city council, the arts council, a university. After the cafe, the Leeds Business Improvement District got in touch and said, would you design a Christmas lights? And I said, well, I'll give you a Christmas experience. And then so it did a similar thing, but in a box in the middle of the train station. And so people pick up on it. And so that's more like a business commission. I've worked with people like IKEA, but I don't put that on my website. So design like immersive installation for them, or Lowry in terms of festival work. So you're sort of, I don't know, you're trying to make it happen wherever you can, and seeing whether or not you can test those ideas in different formats depending on what the funding allows. I mean, that's quite, not sneaky, but you sort of have to work like that.
And if you're just making something simple, same questions I asked Mark, something simple for scratch night in the studio, what advice would you give?
My favorite piece, actually one of the favorite pieces, is a piece called by Rotazaza, and it's a headphone piece, and it's set in a cafe. You put 2 headphones on, and you have a dialogue, and you exchange over this. So you read each other's lines out for each other with headphones. We have access to headphones. It's one of the most magical pieces I've done, because they draw you into the narrative. So you've got these little figures that you kind of watch and you listen and you play. And that to me is just thinking about how you reconfigure the audience relationship with the work. That it's not just an end on. There's nothing wrong with end on, but actually there's so many spatial compositions in the world: a bus, a dining table, a cafe, a pub, that offer you these spatial relationships which we don't necessarily need designing. They're already part of our world. So it's working with that kind of everyday composition.
And tell me about moving back to coming home. So, because obviously you made quite a lot of that work in Leeds, which is a different, different environment. How's it being home?
Back, I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to thinking about other ways of making things in Essex. I think when I was younger, thinking about going to the Queen's, and I loved, my opportunities to see work there. But if you look at Romford, there are less sort of opportunities to do that. So I think there's lots of opportunity, and the Creative People and Places we've already heard about is it's a helping people reimagine our day-to-day lives. And one of my favorite quotes I normally start with actually is, to affect the quality of the day is the highest of the arts. And I think for me, how do we change the day-to-day lives? And looking forward now to building connections in Essex, which is also working Essex producers, Essex writers, Essex, because that is really important to understanding. You can't just import these ideas. It has to be really grown. And so I'm really looking forward to building that connections and looking at maybe class and having a voice. And I've grown to articulate myself, but it absolutely wasn't there to begin with. And how we insert ourselves as artists in spaces to make decisions as creatives, and to feel empowered to do that. It's a challenge. And these networks are brilliant for that, right? They're opening up those conversations, and the designers, we have a thing, Society of British Theatre Designers, we have designer drinks, and we're looking at regional hubs, and there's one in Colchester pub that a designer runs. So we're thinking about how do we keep these creative networks going, and lots of different creative networks is really productive as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered you coming home, but
yeah, no, it does. I'm going to wait because it's 7:45. It's great. It's all really, really inspiring stuff. I'm going to open it up to everyone else for questions. Has anyone got? And you can just speak. It should be fine because we're a good.
I've got a question.
Go on, Liv.
So my question's for David, but I'm sure this will apply to Mark as well, who'll have some insight. I had, sort of 2014 to 2016, I had a theatre company that was doing interactive theatre in site-specific places. And we started, I say we, it was me, I always say we, I don't know why I say we. I started just doing a one-person durational theatre piece on Primrose Hill. But then started doing work for people like Bletchley Park and Kew Gardens and stuff, which was great. But I got completely bogged down in all of the sort of things like dealing with insurance and contracts when I have other people working with me, and then, you know, key performance indicators and mission statements and all of that stuff to keep all your stakeholders and investors happy. And I really lost the ability to keep focused on the creative, because half my brain was still thinking, well, does this, you know, tick this box for this person and all that kind of stuff. And I ended up just walking away from it because I was like, well, this wasn't why I started it. But if I wanted to go back into doing kind of creative work, either like that or in a different style, how do I stop myself getting dragged down by all the admin, basically?
I mean, it's a brilliant question, and one of the ones that is the toughest one for creatives, I think, in producing work. I think having a producer, they're harder to find. I actually find finding a producer really hard, partly because it's like dating. You're trying to find someone who really gets the work and can support you and really who really understands it. So getting them on board up front, which again is really hard because you often then have to write the application to get the funding to get the producer. So seed funding, building up that relationship with trust to allow them to take on all the contracting. I still have done that, and actually that's the thing that's pulled me right down is ability to build a team around me and sustain that team from project to project. So it's okay, I can probably just survive on one, but then I'm exhausted by the end of one to start the next one. And you know, the time period to raise the funding. So it can take a year or 2 years or longer to raise the money to do these things. So I haven't produced anything for years because I haven't got the capacity to do it. Production managers, handing over responsibility, you know, you give it to your lighting design, allow them to inspire and contribute. But for me, a good production manager can just deal with the risk assessments, work out how to make things happen. I often think I should have to come up with all those solutions. But production managers, as far as I know, love the possibility to sort of help and work it out. So yeah, producers, good producers and production.
And what if you don't have the funding, for, particularly when you're first starting to get going and you know that kind of funding isn't available to you? Could you have a mental box? I don't know. How to
scalable. You need to scale it. You need to draw lines of what's achievable. I did my first Arts Council bid. It was £7,000. I did everything. So I designed it, directed it. I didn't write it, but I did all the voiceovers. It was crazy. And then the Arts Council come and said, oh, we wasn't expecting a full production. And I delivered this thing called And It Comes Down to This. And I was really proud of it at the time, but it was just limits of what you can do. Start with the R&D. That is and I'm starting to see all of my work as an experiment now, because you can take that risk away. So keep it small, keep it, and then build up the partners after you've done a first sharing, rather than feeling like you need to deliver the final thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, you know, I'd spoke, you know, the similar things for lots of creators. I think it's just making sure that you divvy up the time for the creative process, you know, that you dip into the creativity and that you assign that time and you allow it not to be interrupted as well. It's hard. It's really hard because the administration of everything just can really, really take over. Are there any other questions? Oh, it's Lauren.
Hi. David, could you talk a bit about the decision to do a PhD related to your creative works? Obviously, that's a very, as well as a creative endeavour, it's a very academic endeavour. And what made you take that path? And also, how do you feel that period of exploring your work academically as well as creatively has informed your work moving forward?
The PhD was transformative for me working out how materials operate. So the PhD gave me a question, which was, how do we immerse audiences in these worlds, and how do materials do that? So once you set yourself the artistic challenge, that, you know, the objects invite engagement, they invite motility, and you start reading about the possibility of those materials, or how you read about an ecology of a performance. That has allowed me to really reconsider, and in many ways it's been a practice of trying things out and testing and experimentation that didn't have the constraints of doing these big kind of outcomes. So I don't think anything on my, actually, and it all comes down to this was a PhD piece, but the rest of them were so small, and I started off with £200 from the local council to do something for like a light night they had there, and it was like, okay, so I did a little thing with torches and little figures, and then it grew and grew and grew. But it was only £200 in a room and some light, and it was playing with that then I was able to document and understand the magic of the way that people were participating. I hated writing about my work. It's something I've always struggled with, to write. I don't feel it's my strength. I make, and it's been quite painful as a process to learn how to cope with writing and expressing myself in that way. But again, it's like a practice of anything. So it's given me a rigor. It's allowed me to see the work, or position the work in the world in a landscape that is quite populated. So I can go, it's performance without performers. It's, you know, you can go, and that, you know, it sells it, or it's this community-based work that, you know, you're going to make it rain inside. You're able to kind of see where it fits, I guess. And so I teach alongside making this work. So I also lecture at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. And I've had to do that really to keep funded on myself. I mean, I'd love to probably establish this work more clearly. But there's also other funding that comes with being able to do that in a university context, and time to play, which is why I asked you, Mark, about that ability to get into a space. And I you know, booking those spaces in to do it. So the university contexts have been useful, but I don't know if that answers the question. But
and Mark, you teach, don't you?
I have done bits of teaching on a freelance basis for my old drama college, RADA, and for National Youth Theatre. I think it's a really interesting way of re-evaluating your own work. You know, students, people who are interested in the work, whether they're students or whether they're people that just want to come and talk to you about it, force you to question what you're doing again. So I would go and light a show for RADA with the students as my assistants, and then we would go back once the show had opened, and I would talk them through the design and what we'd done and how I'd done it. And the questions they would come back to me with were forcing me to go through my mind and reevaluate why I'd made all those choices. And that's a fantastic way of making sure your work is still fresh, that you still understand the interest, why you're making these choices. And that's what we're all about. It's all about a collaboration. And certainly if I do have a student assistant, I would encourage them to make notes on my work and to talk about it. And if they said, why don't we try this light over here? Why don't we try this instead? I'd encourage them to discuss that, and I would try and factor that into the show and get a chance to try it out for them. So that kind of teaching environment is a fantastic way of reinvigorating your own work in many ways. It's questioning yourself, and being forced to question it is always a really useful thing to do.
If there are people on this Zoom or listening to this Zoom, because quite a few people catch up on it, and they were looking for emerging peers, or where would they go if they were looking for collaborators, if they suddenly...
There is the Association of Lighting Designers, the ALD, has a big database of people who are interested in lighting, whether they are fully fledged professional designers or people starting out or students or amateur members. And they are regularly sending out bulletins or requests for advice or people to collaborate with. And certainly that would be one starting point, would be to send the ALD an email and say, look, I've got a piece of work coming up. This is where I'm based. Is there anybody that would be interested in just coming to talk to me or discuss our ideas? Even before a view to taking it on and having it as a paid position. Lots of universities or drama schools have students that would be looking for opportunities to go and try out a piece of work. It's another very exciting way of meeting new collaborators, finding out people who want an opportunity to come and take a bit of time out from their course and actually work on a project. And they can often be the most exciting people to collaborate with because they've got a lot of fresh ideas and they're desperate to try them all out. So that again is a very useful resource. Your local college, your local drama school, definitely.
And David, likewise for designers.
I think my life's changing really bizarrely.
It has, yeah. It's just getting a bit darker.
It's gone all weird.
It's got dark and Ilford.
Atmospheric, yeah.
So I build up really personal connections. Trust is really important for my work, and the intimacy of being able to work with, for example, a writer who's able to really shape it with you, or a composer. So I build them up with friends or connections, or going to see as much work as possible. So therefore, you're in the networks of people who are doing it. Identifying work that might be similar or has a particular aesthetic feel that I want to go for. So then I might then approach a composer because I like that particular feel of what they're doing. And then it's a bit like dating, isn't it? You sort of, have a conversation. You know, you don't have to do any work for you. You have to, once you work with them, you have to sort of trust and start working with them. You can do the R&D processes to test it out. Workshops with people, say, look, I'm doing a workshop. Do you want to come along? So I think it's about nurturing a sensibility. For me, that is really important.
And then if you were looking for young designers, where would you go?
Young design, if you needed design, I would definitely check out the Society of British Theatre Designers, a bit like the ALD. We are just about to launch a new website next month where you'll be able to look for the designers' work. But last year, we developed a project called Staging Places, where you can search regionally for designers in your area and see what kind of work they've been doing. It's about placemaking, so we've looked at regions particularly. Joining those conversations and approaching people, so dropping them an email, finding them on Twitter. I found producers on Twitter.
That's much easier now than it used to be. Keep your tickets in a different pile. If there's a show that you liked, a performance that you liked, put it on a pile, note down which element of it you thought you liked. And then when you're looking for somebody, you go through the pile, you go, that was a show I really liked because that was a fantastic design. That was a fantastic lighting design. A quick Google search on the internet. It's surprisingly easy now, much easier than it was 10 years ago, to track down who those collaborators were and find a way of getting hold of them. So absolutely.
And the graduate shows, I always love a graduate show.
Yeah.
I mean, they happen towards the end of the academic year, don't they? And they're often in London. But
yes,
come.
We would be going into it now, actually, the sort of exhibition. The designers will have design exhibitions. So the major colleges, rather, Rose Bruford in London, Royal College.
Yeah.
They have these exhibitions of lighting, sound, set designs. You actually meet the designers, see their works, they have their cards. And if you're nurturing stuff there, great places to sort of start other younger.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Yeah,
go on, Ed. Go on.
Go on, Molly. Molly, you were first. I saw your hand go up first.
Okay. Just a quick one about self-tapes. Kind of, what lighting equipment would you suggest to use that would be beneficial to kind of enhance the performance a little bit?
Good question.
It's a good question. Again, a lot of that, with the advent of much more cost-effective LEDs now, it's actually much easier and more cost-effective for people to get hold of their own kit. to a certain extent, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you want something that's just going to look as even on camera as possible, then a few LED fixtures and a big sheet of white paper or a white sheet to bounce it off, so you've got it nice and soft. Whereas if you're looking to get something that's a bit stronger, a bit more stylized, then even things like your angle poise opposed to that. So it's quite easy to find a few bits kicking around the house. A white sheet and a garden flood will give you a soft light, and an angle poise will give you a directional light.
You've got a white sheet behind you, haven't you, Molly? Yeah, David, have you got any thoughts of self-taping?
Do it outside.
That's true.
I have no idea. It's weird. Central, their model's changing, so it's really interesting about, you know, the courses that have emerged recently. There's short courses in filming from home, auditioning from home, acting for the screen, which can be done digitally, has become like a thing.
I mean, things interesting about filming outside. I mean, you'd have probably noise issues, but I think you would certainly remember a self-tape that was outside, wouldn't you? As a director watching them, I would go, "Oh, that's the out."
It's probably really bad advice. Don't listen. To
yeah,
it.
no, don't. And Ed, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a question for both of you actually, and thanks for joining us this evening. Can you think of something that you know now that you wish you knew when you started out?
Very good question. There are lots of little technical tricks, I suppose, that you discover in a rather awkward moment in a tech, where something that you were convinced would work and would light the show beautifully is an absolute disaster, and you wish you'd never shown it to everybody else in the tech. Managing one's confidence, I suppose. Also, I was always a believer in jumping into if a big project was offered to you, you jumped in and you took it on, and that stood me in good stead for a lot of time. But I was on one project in particular, I was a little bit gung-ho, and I spent all my meager budget on equipment and not enough on a good assistant. And I had all this lovely equipment, but in a venue where we weren't necessarily well technically supported, I wasn't able to use that equipment as effectively as I would have done if I'd had half the equipment and a good assistant. And that is something that since that point, I've always been very certain of, making sure that a big chunk of that money is always on people to help me out and get me out of trouble, rather than just lots of equipment and lots of
toys. That's great. David?
I think, can I have two things?
Yeah.
I'm going to go with two things. Building and nurturing a team and the importance of that, and sustaining those relationships. Because they're going to be the people that you rely on, and to inspire them to really help you when you really need it. Then I think the main one really, I didn't really feel like I found my voice until my early 30s. I'm sort of pushing later 30s now. And it took that long to work out what the argument my work was. What's it about? What's the thesis? What's the kind of criticality of it? It took me a long time to do that. And I've realized that's come with being able to sustain myself and the sustainability. And it's something I think we're going to need to question as artists for other people, and the privilege that often we find ourselves in, who can sustain themselves. And those people that are able to sustain themselves are still going. But i.e. that they can just move home and live at home and things like that. I don't know how, it did link to the question. But it's what I know now, it's actually sustainability. It's about, actually, you're in it for the long game, and it takes time. And actually a lot of, for my smaller works, you started really small, babies, kind of experimentations. And I just was in the moment, and I really enjoyed being in the moment. But now I can only see it, piecing it, looking back on some of those. But the importance, though, to help other people sustain their careers. That's something we're going to have to challenge. It's really going to have to challenge that, particularly at this particular point in COVID. And who is going to survive out of this? It will be the people who have been able to be at home, not have to be working. So I think that's just a question maybe that we need to think about for independent artists.
Great, it's 8:05. I just want to thank you so much. I think we could have gone on for another hour. It's really, I found it just really creative just for me to talk all of that through. And to remind ourselves about that collaborative process and the possibility of what we do, and does it have to happen in a theatre? Can it happen elsewhere? I just want to flag up, we've got, whilst we're here, we have Holly. Holly, will you give us a wave? So Holly's a member of staff, so who some of you might have had some contact with. I'm just saying it'd be nice to, will you just introduce yourself, Holly, and just say what you do, just in case any member of the Outer Limits would ever want to come to you for a bit of advice about something.
Sure. So I have several different jobs, the first of which being a producing coordinator. So I do all the logistical and admin support for the shows that we make in-house. I also do a lot of the programming, so that's keeping me mostly busy at the moment. And I assist on the casting, and I'm also Doug and Matthew's PA. So usually when people from Outer Limits email me, I go, oh, you really need to talk to Lauren because she knows all about Outer Limits. But things that I can help you with is if you know there's a particular show coming up, if you're an actor and you're really interested in putting yourself forward, then I can talk to you more about that. If you're, I don't know, interested in maybe being put in touch with some of the creatives, I could pass on your details for shows that we have coming up if you're really interested in a particular aspect. And if you have any sort of general inquiries about the Queens, then I'm usually the person that you put through. So.
Brilliant, thanks Holly. And then we've got Christine Piper, who's our production manager as well. You want to introduce yourself and just say why you might be useful if people want to come to you for questions.
Oh, yeah. I'm Christine, so I'm head of production at the Queens, and I oversee all the backstage areas. So I am that person that David was talking about, and obviously spend a lot of time with Mark. Hi, Mark.
Hey.
And you know, if any of you guys want to be put in touch with, obviously I oversee set, costume, lighting, props, sound, all of those technical elements, and obviously have a team of people below me, and can put you in touch with our costume supervisor and our costumes and our props and our furniture. So we've got quite a lot of resources at the Queens, which is really, really great. So I can put you in touch with those people and try and help you out. So yeah, nice to meet everybody.
Yeah, don't worry about, so it's Holly H, isn't it, at Queen's Theatre, queens-theatre.co.uk, and it's Christine P, so one, that's how the format goes, except for me, it's just Douglas. So Christine P at queens-theatre.co.uk. Thank you so much. So big round of applause to Mark and David. Really, really enjoyed having you here. Thank you very, very, very much. It's very, oh, everyone else has come on to wave. Yay. It's nice to see your faces. Brilliant. Oh yeah, before you go, we've got another brilliant session next week. And so Anna Decky, who you might have seen as part of who's been here on Outer Limits, rather brilliant actor, who was at the RSC, and obviously everything just stopped. So she's in Stratford-upon-Avon at the moment. And then Matthew Dewsbury, who was our casting director that I've worked with a lot before the Queens and then also at the Queens. And Matthew really, really helped us with our casting process, which Holly really, really supports as well. So Matthew is also, he is casting at the RSC as well. So he kind of does our work as a bit of a favor. He used to work at the Watermill as well as a casting director. So we're going to be talking everything casting. So lots of, tips and hints from his perspective, what might be useful, what they're looking for. And then I felt it was really important we had an actor and the actor's perspective, what has worked well for them, what hasn't worked well for them. But it's not just from an acting perspective. I think it's also, if you have a company in your casting, they're there to ask your questions, or if you're a director in casting, because that's a really interesting relationship, is the relationship between the director and the casting director. And I think the thing I'm always really shocked by is that most people actually, it seemed to be this kind of really mysterious process. And it's not a mysterious process at all. So I suppose it's going to be a kind of warts and all around casting, and the different, there are different relationships and there are different ways of being done, but we should be able to shorthand some really great things for you to be able to take away around the casting process. So that will be next week, and Lauren will be sending out an email about that tomorrow, I think. Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. See you. Hopefully see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye.